Today, we're going to talk about one of the most important themes in the book of Esther. Actually, in my opinion, is the single most dominant theme in the book of Esther, and that is the theme of authority, power, or more specifically, control. We need to start in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, and we'll go through and see how this theme plays out in the whole book. Chapter 2, verse 8 of Esther says, "When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai." So many girls, obviously that's a vague term, but we know there's what was 127 provinces, and each province got more than one man put in charge of finding the most beautiful virgins there. So assume, at least 3 per province. That seems probably very low, but just assume that. So you're talking, this is minimum 500 girls, probably more than that. So let's stop a moment and think about what life would be like for these girls. Doesn't say they had any choice in the matter. Probably they didn't, based on the way the edict was written. They're taken from their home to a faraway capital city of the empire, and that means they're never going to see their parents or their brothers and sisters again, or any of their relatives or friends. So they're taken away from everyone who loves them, and they get one night with the king, and unless he remembers them by name and requests them, they never see him again. So this is anywhere from 500 to 1,500 girls. So just spending one night with each of them, this contest is lasting years. Now, the question is, do you think he remembered a majority of the girls? Probably not. Probably a few of his favorites. So the majority of the girls would spend one night with kind of a husband, their concubine, so kind of a wife, more of a possession than a wife, but and then that's it. And unless they get pregnant on that first night, they never have a child. They never have a chance to have a child. They don't have a husband who knows their name. This is the majority of them, that they can never see. There's no one in their life who loves them. And they were well provided for, but it's essentially a luxurious prison that these girls are put in. And it's a virtual widowhood. So this is the king's plan, because he needs to replace Vashti, because she dishonored him, so he's got to have honor. And of course, a huge harem is a symbol of honor. So there's the sexual pleasure, there's the status symbol and the ego boost, and he's going to get himself a queen who will be more submissive than Vashti was. Now, of course, the king is very possessive of his things, so no man can ever be near the harem. So the king has all these eunuchs to take care of his harem. And Herodotus, Greek historian, 400s BC, tells us that the Persian Empire would round up from all the provinces 500 boys and castrate them, and they would serve as eunuchs in the palace. So, I mean, assuming these guys were living, decades on from there, within 20 years, you've got thousands of eunuchs serving in the capital city. And so he's got all these eunuchs. No one who's not a eunuch can be near his harem, because no one is allowed to have, no one who could potentially desire these women would be allowed to be near them. So think about the kind of person King Xerxes is, or King Ahasuerus in the Bible. What kind of person is he? Well, I mean, obviously he's cruel, or at least thoughtless of what things are like for other people. It doesn't matter that hundreds of young girls are going to live a life destitute of family and love. That's not important. What's important is that he gets what he wants. So if it's not cruelty, it's at least carelessness. It doesn't matter that he does the same thing to hundreds and hundreds, thousands of young men, young boys. They can never have a family. They can never have children. They're just going to be servants in the palace for the rest of their lives. He does the same thing to them, and that doesn't matter. What's important is that no one could dishonor him by sleeping with one of his concubines that he's probably forgotten about. Sleeping with a king's concubine was another status symbol in ancient times. A lot of times when there was a coup, the new king would publicly sleep with the whole harem to prove that he was the new boss in town, sort of a thing. So kings were very protective of their harem. So what's important is that his harem is protected. The lives of these young men, that doesn't matter. What's important is him. So that gives us a little insight into who he is. Now, you notice in verse 8, the girls are brought under the care of Haggai. And this is one of the king's eunuchs who's in charge of the harem. And let's see what happens in verse 9. At the end of 8, Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. Verse 9. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatment and special food. He assigned her 7 maids selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. So this Haggai character, he likes Esther. We know very little about him, but we know one thing from this verse, is he's in charge of the whole harem, all these young virgins. After they sleep with the king and are no longer virgins, and they're out of his care, and they go to a different eunuch. But is he fair in his dealings with all these young women that he's in charge of? No, obviously not. He shows favoritism to Esther. So that fact that he's unfair will come into play later. So just file that away for now. I know it might seem insignificant at the moment, but it comes into play later when we're really diving into the king's character. So let's skip down to verse 12. Here's how the contest worked. Before a girl's turn came to go in to the king Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem under the care of Shashagaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, of the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any other of the women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then he gives a banquet. The king's very fond of banquets. It's a big theme in Esther, is banquets, to celebrate choosing a new queen, a better queen than Vashti. Okay, what is the king's focus here? We know he's thoughtless of others, only focused on his own immediate pleasures. And there's mostly bodily pleasures, but immediate pleasures because there's the ego theme. Does all that fit with what we learned in chapter 1? Yeah, I mean, chapter 1 was all about food and wine and showing off his wealth and his ego and his rage. Rage, we may not think of rage as like a bodily urge, the way hunger or a desire for alcohol or sex is, but rage is one of those, in a sense, if you think about physical chemicals in your body that, and you know, if you've ever been extremely angry, that you literally feel blood rushing to your face, and you feel physiological things happening inside you when you feel that rage. Your heart beats faster. So he needs to satisfy all his urges, including his rage. He's got to have some huge punishment for Vashti, and then his anger can subside. That happens later in the book too. He sticks someone on top of a impalement pole, and then, okay, now that satisfies my rage. So this is a guy who is dominated, his driving motivations are his physical and immediate bodily needs. And I think rage is significant. I'm spending a lot of time on it because I think it gives us a clue to something about Xerxes. He is a man whose passions supersede his thought or his reason. All right, to put it metaphorically, it's a body over head type of a thing. That sounds strange to us, like his body is more important than his head. That sounds strange, but that is the way ancient people thought about these things. Sometimes when you see like the Minotaur, right, man's body, animal head, it's the worst of both worlds. You get the weak human body and the stupid animal head. So that's the Minotaur, and then you get the Centaur. It's the best of both worlds, the strong animal body and the intelligent human head. So my point is that ancient people thought about things in terms of body and head. So this is a guy who's got his body ruling over his head. His flesh rules over his spirit. And this sounds strange too, but the animal is greater than the man in metaphorical terms. In other words, Xerxes is presented by this author as kind of a beast, not in a cool beast, what a beast, but in an animal sense, his animal desires, right? And you might think, well, the ego one, that's not an animal one, but if you think about in packs of wolves, there is a desire for dominance and honor, wanting to be the alpha male. So that's the kind of guy he is, and there's evidence all through the book. We'll cruise through and look at a couple passages real quick to support that, just in case you just in case you want a little more evidence. In chapter 3, verses 8 through 11, then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples of the provinces of the king of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of the other peoples." He's talking about the Jews here. He doesn't say Jews. "And they do not obey the king's laws." Whether or not that's true, there's really one person who didn't obey, which was Mordecai, who didn't bow down to this guy, Haman. But it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. So Haman here is telling the king what's in his best interest. "If it please the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So that's 300 tons of silver. It's a lot of silver. So Haman's saying, "King, I think it's best for you if you commit genocide and wipe out a race of people. It's not important which race, just trust me. I think it's best for you if these people go." So, verse 10 of chapter 3, "The king took the signet ring off his finger and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. 'Keep the money,' the king said to Haman, 'and do with the people as you please.'" NIV says, "Keep the money." Other versions say, "The money's in your hand," which is a little more vague. It does seem later that he pays the money into the treasury, but regardless of that, the king gives him his signet ring. Okay. The kings at this time were illiterate, of course, so most of them, Ashurbanipal wasn't, but most of them were. But the ring is the way he seals an official law for the empire. So essentially, if you have the ring, you're running the empire. And the king's like, "Oh yeah, good idea, genocide, whatever, here, take this, you do it, and just don't make me have to think about that stuff." Okay, so Haman writes this edict saying on a certain day, all Jews, it's like the purge, it's legal to kill Jews. They should all be killed. If you live near a Jew, you can't kill them, men, women, children, they all die, and you can have all their stuff. So that's a law. And then at the end of this chapter, spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out. This is verse 15. "The edict was issued in the citadel of Susa, and King Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered." The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Why are they thrown into confusion, some translations say? And think about what it's like for the people. Suddenly there's an edict said on a certain day, everyone's supposed to kill Jews. It's legal to murder this race of people. Now, even if you're not Jewish and you hear that, you're like, whoa, what? This is a thing now? It can just, murder can just be legalized like that? Genocide's just like, okay, it's just a thing we do now? This is a multicultural melting pot empire, especially the capital. And, I mean, you can imagine what it would be like if suddenly there was a law like that in America. If we just like picked a race of people. You know, we just said Italian Americans. On such and such a day, it's legal. If you have any Italian neighbors or of Italian descent, you can murder them and take their stuff. That's the new law. I mean, you can see why the city is thrown into confusion, or in this case, bewildered. But the king, is the king bewildered? No. He's just having a drinking party with Haman. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So, this is a guy who's not thinking things through. He doesn't ask, okay, so you want to wipe out, well, which race is it, and what exactly are they doing? Is it really worth that? Because I don't want to think about all that. Just bring the wine, bring the wine. Yeah, here's my ring. Bring on the wine. There's a guy who doesn't think for himself. Obviously, Haman's manipulating him. That's been happening. You know, Mamukin manipulated him in chapter 1, and then the whole sex contest in chapter 2 was not his idea. Somebody else suggested it to him, and he was like, oh, that sounds good. Let's look at briefly one verse in chapter 8:8. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name, sealed with his ring, can be revoked. So now Haman, who had the ring, is fallen out of favor. He takes the ring back from him and gives it to Mordecai, and he's like, here, just fix this. You can't undo that law, but write some other law that'll just take care of it. That's the kind of guy. And then one last reference, which I think is critical to understanding the king's character. It's chapter 6. Chapter 6 is obviously the pivotal scene in this whole book. It's the center. The book is actually a big chiasm. It's the very center, the pivotal scene where the whole plot turns on its head. Chapter 6, verse 3, and then the beginning of 4. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Asked the king. Mordecai had saved his life earlier. Nothing has been done for him, the attendants answered. Verse 4, the king said, who is in the court? Why does he ask that? You would think he says, oh, that guy saved my life and I didn't do anything for him. This was years ago. You know what? Send him 1,000 gold coins or something. You know what? Give him make a statue of him and put it in the city somewhere. He doesn't say, you know what? Write him a letter and just ask him, say, what do you want for a reward? I should reward you. He doesn't come up with anything himself. He says, who's in the court? And they're like, oh, Haman's here. And he's like, good, bring him in. Haman, what should I do for somebody I want to honor? This is a guy who cannot think for himself. He cannot make a decision. When he realizes something needs to be done, the first thing he says is, who's around? Which one of my advisors is around? And Haman's there, you know the story, there so that he can ask permission to impale Mordecai on a pole. But anyway, so lots of interesting things happening in chapter 6. But my point is, this is a guy who is unable to think for himself. I'll give two more short evidences in the book, chapter 7, verse 6 through 9. Esther said, this is at the banquet when she reveals that Haman's the bad guy to the king. Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage and left his wine and went out to the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As soon as the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Okay, so you get the scene. He's suddenly in a rage. He's like, it was him. And he's like, you tricked me, my favorite advisor. He gets up in a drunken rage, stumbles away from the table. Obviously, Haman knows what the king is like when he's in a rage and that things are not going to go well, so he's not going to deal with him. He's going to talk to Esther, that turns against him too, because the king mistakes it for someone's trying to be near my queen. This is what's interesting. The king was obviously furious at Haman for tricking him, although it's Xerxes' own fault. When someone says, hey, you want to kill a race of people, and you don't even ask who, and you don't even ask why, you just kind of let it go, then it's your own fault. But regardless, suddenly she says he's bad now, so now I hate him now. But this is what's interesting, is verse 9. He's in a rage. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a gallows, NIV says gallows, impalement pole is probably more accurate, but a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged him, hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's fury subsided. So this is what's interesting. The king's super mad, but can't make any decision about what to do. And one of the eunuchs, slaves, says, you're mad at this guy? There happens to be a big pointy spike at his house, 75 feet high. He made it for Mordecai, the guy that saved your life. Hint, hint. Nudge, nudge. Oh, okay, hang him on it. Great. He doesn't say great idea. Probably mentally takes credit for that idea. But even the eunuchs are controlling him because his own rage cripples him. Right? His own need for control. I have to be in control. How dare you manipulate me? It's the same thing that happened in chapter 1 with Vashti. What? She didn't obey me? I have to be in control. This theme of control, this guy that needs to be in control, but uses his power, he's the most powerful man on earth, uses his power to feed his bodily desires, his immediate pleasures, his own pride and everything he wants. It actually makes him lose control. Once he gives himself over to his pleasures, he no longer controls himself, they control him. Suddenly everyone around him is controlling him. He becomes a little marionette that everyone else is controlling. Hey, I'll give you the money if you give this. We'll give you honor if you get this. You'll get respect if you make an edict saying all women have to respect men. And everyone will think you're great if you have all the most beautiful women in the world for yourself. Last thing, going back to Haggai. It said that Esther only took, she could take anything in with her. She only took what Haggai, the king's eunuch, suggested. The question is, do you think Haggai suggested something to every single young virgin? Was he fair? We already know he's not fair. We already know Esther's his favorite. So there's a hint there. It's actually Haggai who's controlling the king's choice of the next queen. He knows what the king's like. He's been in the palace his whole life. These 14-year-old girls, they don't know anything about the king. He works the system. She gets the best beauty treatment. She gets the best everything to control behind the scenes the king's choice, to get his favorite in power. So all this theme of people controlling other people and the king in control of all these people and sending out edicts to control this big whole thing, the person who seems to be in charge and controlling isn't people working behind the scenes, manipulating other people. All of that hints at the theme of Esther, which is who is in control. Obviously, God's name isn't mentioned, but God's working behind the scenes in all of this. So lots to learn about human nature, about what it's like when humans get power, learn about humans manipulating, humans having self-control, humans allowing their own desires to control them. Lots to learn about all that, and lots to learn about how God operates in this world. You don't always see him, you don't always hear his voice, like in other books of the Bible, but here, God's working behind the scenes, and the author is carefully suggesting all these things, but you have to read it critically, and you have to read it thoughtfully, and you can't jump to conclusions. Now that we've learned about the king's character, for next week, here's your food for thought. How does what we now know about King Xerxes, how does that shed light on Vashti? And the big question is, why didn't she come when she was called in chapter 1? All right, till next week.